I first noticed something off about Vivienne Crane during her second week at Meridian Analytics. She glided into the morning stand-up meeting with that same effortless confidence, her dark hair perfectly styled, her presence commanding attention without her saying a word. Our team lead, Marcus, stumbled over his status update when she smiled at him. Third time that week. I'm Alex Chen, Senior Data Analyst. I've worked at Meridian for 5 years, and I've seen my share of ambitious new hires. But Vivienne was different. The way people looked at her, the way conversations shifted when she entered a room. It reminded me of something my grandmother used to warn me about, back when I thought her stories were just folklore. Vivienne had joined our department as a junior analyst, but you wouldn't know it from how she carried herself. She dressed impeccably, spoke with polished authority, and had an uncanny ability to be in the right place at the right time. Within days, she was attending meetings above her pay grade. Within 2 weeks, senior staff were asking for her input on strategy. She's just really talented, my coworker Priya said when I mentioned it. But Priya's eyes looked distant when she said it, and she'd been acting strange ever since Vivienne complimented her presentation. The first real incident happened 3 weeks in. James Park, our top performer and Marcus's obvious choice for the upcoming team lead promotion, called in sick. Food poisoning, he said. Violent and sudden. He'd been fine the day before, right up until he'd disagreed with Vivienne about a client approach during the afternoon meeting. He was out for a week. When he came back, he looked drained, older somehow. And he deferred to Vivienne constantly. That's when I started paying closer attention. My grandmother had taught me to see what others missed. She'd insisted I learn the old ways, even as I built my career in tech. The corporate world is just another jungle, Alex, she'd said. And there are always predators. I'd inherited her sensitivity, her sight. I could feel the threads of energy that most people ignored. And around Vivienne, those threads were very, very wrong. The patterns emerged quickly once I knew to look. Vivienne would have a conflict with someone. Nothing dramatic, just professional disagreement or competition. Then that person would have a run of bad luck. Missed deadlines due to mysterious computer crashes. Presentations that inexplicably corrupted. Sudden illness before important meetings. Mistakes that seemed completely out of character. And every time, Vivienne would step in to help, to cover, to shine. Sarah Kim, our HR representative, mentioned in passing that she'd received 3 complaints about hostile work environment in the past month. All from people who'd previously been doing well. All people who'd crossed Vivienne in some way. But when Sarah tried to investigate, the complainants would suddenly withdraw their statements, looking confused, saying they'd overreacted. I don't understand it, Sarah confided in me over coffee. It's like people forget why they were upset. I understood it perfectly. I'd seen the tiny cloth bag Vivienne kept in her desk drawer, spotted when she'd asked me to grab a file for her. I'd noticed the unusual ring she wore, which she turned inward during confrontations. I'd watched her lips move silently while maintaining eye contact with people who would later suffer strange misfortunes. Vivienne Crane was a practitioner. A witch. And she was using the craft to climb the corporate ladder. The real confirmation came during the company happy hour at Sullivan's Bar. I'd positioned myself near Vivienne, watching. She was holding court with several senior managers, including our VP of Operations, Robert Chen, no relation to me. She laughed at his jokes, touched his arm lightly, and I saw her trace a small symbol on the bar top with her fingertip when she thought no one was looking. Robert's demeanor changed instantly. His pupils dilated slightly. He leaned in closer, hanging on her every word. By the end of the evening, he was promising her FaceTime with the CEO. I went home that night and opened my grandmother's journals. She'd documented decades of encounters with practitioners who misused their gifts. The craft is about balance, Alex, she'd written. Those who use it for pure self-gain always overreach. The universe has a way of correcting itself. Sometimes it just needs a little help. The situation escalated after the quarterly review meeting. Marcus announced that due to James's continued underperformance, he was recommending Vivienne for the team lead position instead. James sat there, hollow-eyed, and nodded agreement. Priya looked like she wanted to protest but couldn't quite form the words. Everyone else seemed to think this made perfect sense, despite Vivienne having been with the company for barely 2 months. I was the only one who voted against it during the team feedback session. Vivienne's eyes locked onto mine, and for just a moment, I saw something ancient and cold behind her beautiful features. Her smile never wavered, but I felt the temperature in the room drop. "I appreciate your honesty, Alex," she said smoothly. "I hope I can change your mind with my performance." That night, my laptop crashed. My car wouldn't start the next morning. I received an email from HR about a supposed policy violation I definitely hadn't committed. Small things. Testing things. She was probing my defenses, seeing what would stick. But I'd been warded since childhood. My grandmother's protections were woven into jewelry I never removed, sigils I'd drawn in my apartment, intentions I renewed with every full moon. Vivienne's hexes slid off me like water off glass. She noticed. Of course she noticed. The thing about workplace witches is that they get comfortable. They get sloppy. They assume no one else in the fluorescent-lit world of spreadsheets and synergy understands what they're doing. Vivienne had probably been doing this for decades, maybe centuries. Moving from company to company, climbing fast, then disappearing before questions got too serious. Starting over with a new name, a new background, ageless and unstoppable. But she'd made a crucial mistake. She'd gotten greedy. The new CEO position was opening up at the regional level. Word was they were looking internally first. Vivienne had her sights set on it. I watched her work the room at the leadership conference, saw her weaving influence like a spider building a web. She'd targeted Daniel Torres, the current CEO, along with 4 board members. Each conversation ended with that same glazed look of fascination in their eyes. She was using an amplification hex, I realized. Something to magnify her natural charisma to supernatural levels. Powerful, but dangerous. The kind of magic that required anchors, sacrifices. The kind that left traces. I started documenting everything. Not for HR, they'd never understand. But I tracked the pattern of misfortunes following in Vivienne's wake. I photographed the unusual herbs I spotted in her tea. I recorded timestamps of when people's behavior changed after speaking with her. I collected evidence that worked on both mundane and supernatural levels. And I started preparing my counter-move. My grandmother had taught me that the best way to deal with a corrupt practitioner wasn't direct confrontation. They'll have defenses, protections, countermeasures, she'd explained. Instead, you create a situation where their own magic unravels them. You build a trap that uses their greed and overconfidence against them. The opportunity came with the announcement of the CEO Selection Committee's final deliberation meeting. Vivienne was practically vibrating with anticipation. She'd spent weeks laying groundwork, and everyone she'd influenced would be in that room. Her victory seemed inevitable. I spent the 3 days before the meeting working late in the office. Not on presentations or reports. On something else entirely. I blessed the conference room with salt water during my lunch break, hiding it as routine cleaning. I carved sigils of revelation into the underside of the conference table where Vivienne would sit. I burned specific herbs in the break room, letting the smoke drift through the ventilation system. And I prepared a tea blend, perfectly legal and mundane in appearance, that I knew Vivienne wouldn't be able to resist. She was always drinking herbal tea. The night before the meeting, I performed a ritual my grandmother had called the mirror's return. It didn't harm or hex. It simply reflected back whatever energy someone was putting out into the world. Amplified it. Made it visible. For someone living a normal life, it would do nothing. For someone like Vivienne, saturated in her own manipulation magic, it would be devastating. The morning of the meeting, I arrived early and placed the tea on the break room counter with a note that said, "Special blend for the big day, enjoy," from the morning crew. I knew Vivienne's routine. I knew her ego. She'd see it as tribute, as recognition of her impending victory. She'd drink it. The meeting started at 10 a.m. I'd convinced Sarah from HR to let me observe, claiming I was interested in learning about the leadership selection process. She'd agreed, probably still influenced by whatever remnant magic Vivienne had used on her weeks ago. Vivienne entered looking triumphant, carrying a travel mug of tea. My tea. She took her seat, smiled at Daniel Torres, and began her final presentation on why she should lead the regional division. For the first 5 minutes, it was flawless. Her usual charisma, her polished delivery, her seemingly natural authority. The committee members leaned forward, captivated. Then the sigils activated. The mirror's return began its work. Vivienne continued talking, but something was changing. Her skin, which had always looked flawless and ageless, started to show its true wear. Fine lines appeared around her eyes. Her hair, so lustrous and dark, showed gray at the roots. Her hands, gesturing gracefully, began to look older, the skin papery and thin. She didn't notice at first. She was too focused on her pitch. But the committee members were noticing. Confused glances. Furrowed brows. Daniel Torres blinked rapidly, as if clearing his vision. The reflection was spreading beyond just her appearance. The energy she'd been pouring into the room, the supernatural influence she'd been wielding, was becoming visible. Not as light or color that cameras would catch, but as a feeling, a pressure that suddenly felt wrong and invasive. People shifted uncomfortably. Marcus rubbed his temples. Priya's eyes widened, as if waking from a long sleep. Vivienne faltered mid-sentence. She'd felt the shift. Her hand went to her ring, turning it frantically. But the mirror's return was already at work, and her own defensive magic just fed more energy into the reflection. Are you feeling all right, Miss Crane? Daniel asked, and his voice was different. Clearer. The fog of her influence was lifting. Vivienne touched her face, and I saw the moment she realized what was happening. Her carefully maintained glamour, the spell that had kept her looking 35 instead of whatever her true age was unraveling. In front of the entire committee. In front of witnesses. She stood abruptly, knocking over her tea mug. I need to excuse myself, she said, but her voice cracked, losing its supernatural smoothness. The mirror's return doesn't just reflect magic back at its source. It amplifies it, lets everyone in range feel what's been done to them. Every hex she'd cast, every manipulation she'd woven, every mind she'd clouded, all of it was suddenly hanging in the air like smoke, visible and undeniable to everyone who'd been affected. Wait, Robert Chin said slowly, his voice thick with confusion. What was I saying about the CEO role? Why was I so insistent that Vivienne was the only candidate? Sarah from HR stood up, her eyes suddenly sharp and alert. I need to restart some investigations, she said quietly. I think I've been missing things. Vivienne backed toward the door, but her usual grace was gone. She looked panicked, decades older than she had minutes before, her carefully crafted corporate persona crumbling along with her magic. Marcus was staring at his hands like he didn't recognize them. James, he said suddenly. Where's James? Why did I demote him? The room was waking up. Every person Vivienne had influenced was shaking off the effects, and with the mirror's return active, they could feel the residue of what had been done to them. They didn't understand it in magical terms, but they understood violation. They understood manipulation. Vivienne's eyes found mine across the room. She knew. In that instant, she understood that I'd done this, that I'd been aware of what she was all along, that I'd used her own overconfidence to trap her. You, she breathed, and her voice carried venom and disbelief. She'd probably never encountered another practitioner in a corporate setting. Probably thought she was the only one who'd thought to blend magic and ambition in the mundane world. I smiled slightly and tapped my grandmother's pendant, hidden under my collar. An old protection, an old tradition. Recognition passed between us, which to which, and she understood the full scope of what I'd done. The mirror's return was still working, still amplifying, still reflecting. People were starting to remember strange moments, odd coincidences, times when they'd acted completely out of character around Vivienne. The supernatural influence had become so obvious in its reflection that even people without sight could feel something had been terribly wrong. "Security," Daniel said into his phone, his voice steady and cold. "We need someone in conference room 3B. Vivienne lunged for the door, but her usual supernatural grace was gone, drained by the reflection of her own magic. She stumbled, caught herself, and I saw genuine fear flash across her face. Fear and fury and the dawning realization that everything she'd built here was destroyed. Not just her position. Her entire method was compromised. She couldn't stay, couldn't spin this, couldn't hex her way out when everyone in the room could suddenly feel what she'd been doing to them. The mirror's return would fade in a few hours, but the damage was permanent. Every connection she'd made, every alliance she'd forged, every step up the ladder she'd climbed through manipulation, all of it was contaminated now. People would question everything she'd ever said or done. And more than that, she knew there was another practitioner in this building now. Someone who'd outmaneuvered her. Someone who'd been watching and waiting and had struck at the perfect moment. She'd never feel safe in a corporate environment again, never know if that random coworker might be someone like me, someone like her, someone who could see what she really was. My grandmother had been right. The universe does correct itself. Sometimes it just needs a skilled hand to help the process along. Security arrived at the door. Sarah was already pulling up files, her face set in grim determination. Marcus was texting James frantically. The board members were comparing notes, their voices rising in confused anger as they tried to understand why they'd all been so certain Vivienne was perfect for leadership. Vivienne looked at me one last time. Her glamour was completely gone now. She looked old, so old, ancient even. Centuries of life showed in her eyes, along with the bitter understanding that she'd finally, after probably dozens or hundreds of successful corporate infiltrations, met her match. I held her gaze steadily, letting her see that I wasn't gloating, wasn't celebrating. Just enforcing balance. Just protecting my territory and my colleagues from a predator who'd overstepped. Her face twisted with rage and something that might have been grudging respect. Then security was guiding her out, and Sarah was following, already on the phone with corporate HR, and the conference room erupted in overlapping conversations as people tried to make sense of what they'd experienced. I quietly gathered my things and slipped out while everyone was distracted. My work here was done. Vivienne would disappear, as her kind always did when exposed. She'd move on to another city, another company, another identity. But she'd be more careful now. She'd remember that she wasn't the only one walking both worlds. And I'd go back to my cubicle, my spreadsheets, my quarterly reports. Back to being invisible, ordinary Alex Chen, senior data analyst. No one would suspect that I'd just banished a centuries-old witch from their workplace using a combination of corporate procedure and ancient craft. That's the thing about being a practitioner in the modern world. The best magic is the kind nobody sees. The most effective hexes are the ones that look like natural consequences. And the strongest protection is making sure the monsters think you're just another sheep right up until the moment you bare your teeth. I reached my desk and opened my laptop, already composing an email to James about the team lead position he deserved. The office hummed around me with its usual sounds, fluorescent lights buzzing, keyboards clicking, someone laughing at the coffee maker. Just another day at Meridian Analytics. Except upstairs, in conference room 3B, Vivienne Crane was realizing that her reign of supernatural manipulation had ended not with a dramatic magical duel, but with a carefully laid trap that had used her own power to destroy her credibility completely. The look on her face as security led her past my floor, visible through the glass walls, was one of pure shock and impotent rage. Our eyes met one final time through the transparent barrier. She mouthed something, probably a curse or a threat, but it didn't matter. The protections my grandmother had taught me would hold. They always had. I turned back to my screen and smiled.